This is Functionally Literate. I am Ryan.
I am Zach.
We are doing a deep dive into swords and sorcery stories. And so the way to do that is to talk about mythology.
We start at the beginning.
Every week we talk about mythology, at least so far. We talked about Greek myths. We've talked about Celtic myths. We've talked about Norse myths, not in that order.
Not in that order.
And now today we are talking about Egyptian myths.
That's right. We're gonna wrap up classical mythology with Egyptian.
And I'll tell you what, there's a lot that I did not realize I did not know. I thought I had pretty well covered all of it in grade school.
You know, we got to do a field trip to the St. Louis Science Center.
Mm-hmm.
I got to see on that big Omnitron theater they have there, this documentary about the Nile and some of the cities and ruins they find there. They told me none of this stuff.
Yeah. Same.
Yeah. Which, although I will say reading, I'm like, yeah, I wouldn't tell a grade school child that either.
So can I tell you, I want to start this off, because really what this is we're telling stories. Like, we've read some stuff, and we're going to tell you our favorite stories from what we've read.
Yes.
But I want to start with the story of how difficult it actually was for me to just find something to read.
Yeah, that's true. You had a bit of a challenge there.
So we used different sources for this.
Yes.
I have The Egyptian Myths, A Guide to the Ancient Gods and Legends by Gary J. Shaw, published by Thames and Hudson.
I have Gods and Myths of Ancient Egypt by Robert A. Armour.
Okay. I think my book was published in 2009.
You know, I don't actually remember checking. It is by the American University in Cairo Press. Oh, with research assistance of Allison Baker. That's important. Got to give credit where credit's due. This is the 11th printing in the year 2000. Copyright is 1986.
Gary Shaw has a doctorate in Egyptology from the University of Liverpool, and he is taught at the American University in Cairo.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So this book comes from where he taught.
Cool.
American University in Cairo.
There you go.
Although he's from Liverpool, so he's not American.
No, he's
British.
He's British.
They have a strong tie to Egypt and have for a while.
Imperialistic ties.
A tenuous tie, but a strong one nonetheless.
So the story of how I came to this book.
Yeah.
So I've settled into my new job. I'm going to be a little bit vague here, but I am the guy that buzzes people in at a school, specifically a high school.
Nice.
I buzz people in, and I make sure they're supposed to be here, and I make sure kids check in. If they're
now
tardy, they are tardy.
Live in a society where people must be buzzed into a high school.
Yeah. There's a little security box that I have to also buzz them into. I have to buzz them in through 2 doors.
Well, I mean, obviously.
Yeah. Fortunately, the second one, I can just buzz, and they can come in. The first one, they have to push the button, or I can't let them in. So some dummies don't even see it, because it's on a pillar.
Yeah.
They're just looking at that door. They don't even see.
There's like, how do I get in?
Open!
Let me in!
And I just sit there, and I'm like, it's so funny, because sometimes students will be yelling at them, "You've got it," but they can't hear them. It's like, bulletproof glass.
Yeah.
And so I'm like, listen, they have to figure it out themselves.
If they aren't smart enough to get into the building,
if they're like, all they have to do,
don't belong here.
All they have to do is think to look at that pillar and push that button.
It's not a puzzle box at MIT, guys. It's the door to a high school.
Well, anyways, so I've been settling into that and haven't had time to, go and actually find a book. So my first attempt was the library there.
School library.
Turns out my employee ID number is all I need to get books from the library at the school.
Awesome.
So I looked on the digital catalog, found a book that I thought would fit my purposes, and I was wrong. Simply because it approaches it from a historical viewpoint, not a mythological viewpoint. So there's a lot of shit in there that
you're gonna find a lot of that where, and even in this book, it addresses it quite a bit. Although it still tells the stories about like, well, and then this story changed in this way, and these two characters kind of got conflated, and that probably had to do with the political rising of this cult over this one. And it's like, I don't care too much about that.
Even in this book that I found, which I find to be probably the best source that I could have found for what specifically I was looking for, because what I was looking for was stories first. Like, I want to know the stories of these gods, and if there's different versions of those stories, fine, tell me all of them.
Yeah.
But it was a lot of, like, when you look at it from a historical standpoint, the stories change over time.
Right.
So when you look at it from a historical standpoint, it's like, oh, well, we gleaned from this that, this is the story, and we gleaned from this that this is the story. And it's like, I don't give a shit about any of that right now. I want to know the stories first. I want prose.
Right.
And this provided that to a degree. And then the second half of the book was like, oh, so how did this relate to how ancient Egyptians lived their lives? So I've got a lot of info about that.
That's also interesting.
Yeah. I don't know if your book talked about that as much.
Only in that it did discuss to some extent some of the rituals that were performed around the gods and how those were inspired by the stories. And so it'd be like, well, here's this story. And, we're pretty sure this came to rise in popularity this time in Egypt because this cult got really politically powerful and they wanted to shove out these other people.
So that's the other thing. They straight up call them cults.
Yes.
Cults of Horus, cult of Thoth, cult of Ra, etc. Yes. Like they're... Yes. And so I think that is interesting that that's baked in. That, like, they straight up call themselves... Did they call themselves cults, or is that a word that was attributed to them later?
I'm willing to bet it was just attributed to them later, although they may have had a specific word for it. But what I find interesting about their use of the word cult is that they all ascribe to the same general religion.
Yeah.
Which is this sort of polytheistic, looser pantheon. I mean, they have the Aeneid, but sort of a looser pantheon than we're used to seeing in other classical systems. Much more similar to the Celtics than it is the Norse or the Greek, where it's like, these are the hard, fast, these are the gods, these are not. Whereas the Celtics, there were hundreds.
Yeah.
So it's more similar to that. But groups would devote specific worship to a member of that divine order, not the whole. So, like, cults as we know them today would have very specific claims of like, no, that's not real. This is real. Like some people, like...
There was a lot of that back then too, though. I actually kind of want to get into that.
There was some, yeah.
I want to put a pin in that thought because I have a rebuttal.
Yeah. Well, and you're going to have that everywhere. But to the point where, like, if there's the cult of Bastet...
Yeah.
Was not arguing that Ra did not exist, or that Ra wasn't the king of the gods or the father of the gods who rowed the boat over the side. Like that wasn't the argument of the cult of Bastet. They're just like, but we don't do rituals for Ra. There's other people that do that shit.
You want to go...
We do rituals for Bastet.
Yeah.
That's what we do. So we're the cult of Bastet, not because we don't think these other gods exist or don't have power or aren't important. It's just we have a role in society, and this one is ours.
I will say, though, and this is what I wanted to put a pin in. I'm pulling the pin out now because I have a rebuttal. There was a lot of... Because there were 42 gnomes.
Yes.
Which was essentially like regions. And each gnome had a city.
Yep.
Right? There were 22 in... So this is really weird. Like, I kind of have to get into, like, just... the landscape of Egypt to talk about the mythology of Egypt.
A little bit.
I've noticed that that's a recurring trend.
Yes, the geography played a pretty big part.
In pretty much all religions we've covered so far.
Yes. I'd say it's more at the forefront in Egyptian than anything
I would agree.
Yet. But I mean, I will say once we get to, like, specifically Polynesian, that's going to become much more prevalent.
Really? Okay. Well, I'm looking forward to that. Because this book most succinctly explaining the geography of it to me helped me understand the Egyptian mythology in a way that I don't think I ever did as a child. Like, I think it was just, like, over my head. Like, they talked about the Nile, but I don't remember it ever being explained to me why the Nile was actually important.
Yeah.
Right? And so you've got Upper Egypt, which is the southern half, which is, like, all desert, right? And it's divided by the Nile. The western half of the desert is, like, just all desert plains, right? And then the eastern half of the Nile is mountainous deserts. Right?
Yep.
But it doesn't. But like it's all desert, which all the Egyptians consider treacherous.
Yep.
Like as I understand it, the Egyptians that lived in the 20 nomes in the upper region of Egypt, like they pretty much stayed in their towns and didn't really stray very far out of their towns.
Yeah.
And then you've got Lower Egypt, which is the northern half, which is all plains because the Nile River, it's just one river all through Upper Egypt. But then when you get to Lower Egypt, it spiderwebs into this giant plateau. In one of the books that I read before I realized that this was just like so this was the story that I wanted to get into. I failed with my attempt at the school library, so I went to the public library on Tuesday. On Tuesday, I found 2 books. I found this book, and I found another book that I didn't even bother bringing because it was a spiritual journey. It using Egypt as a backdrop.
It was a sort of religious self-help.
So I read the first chapter of that book, and then when I got to the second chapter, like the way it kept repeatedly phrasing things, like I was like, oh no, this is not what I want. I want to learn about the gods. I don't want to go. I'm not like interested in using the Nile as a metaphor for the brain and like exploring all these nodes. And no, thank you.
I'm not trying to find the universal truth of the universe through the characters of Egyptian mythology.
I actually want to be a big nerd and talk about the aspects of Egyptian gods. That's how
I want to know which one's a dick. I want to know which one's chill. I want to know which one's a nerd like me. Who's the slutty friend?
Right.
Who's the stay-at-home stick in the mud? That's what I want to know.
Because if we've learned anything about pantheons, there's all of that in all of them.
Yes. Not to slut-shame the gods, but yes.
You know, there's always...
It was Zeus in Greece.
There's always gods of fertility.
He's the slut friend.
Well, I'll tell you what. Seth is the fucking rapist asshole that everyone tolerates.
That is true. That is true.
Just throwing that out there. Yeah. I'm a Horus fan all the way.
Horus. Generally speaking, that is most people are like, yeah, Set sucks. He's a dickhead.
Yeah.
So, well, I'm glad you were able to finally find a book that had what you were looking for.
Yeah. The whole first half is like all about the gods. Whole second half is about like how the ancient Egyptians lived their lives, and then also, oh hey, Book of the Dead, a guide.
Yes.
And then what was after that?
Yeah. I will say it was interesting for me researching to find a good source book for this stuff because unlike the 3 previous kinds of mythology that we had covered with the Greco-Roman, the Norse, and the Celtic, with Egyptian mythology, it's typical, although not universally true, that the more recent versions are probably the more accurate. Whereas with like Greco-Roman stuff, you want the earliest stuff because it's been presumably the least Christianized, the least changed over time. It's more accurate to what the present day or what the then current Greeks and Romans would have been living with the knowledge of. Same with Norse, same with Celtic. But those were some comparatively young civilizations that did a decent job recording that stuff, especially Greece. That said, basically everything we know about Egyptian mythology, we've learned from, murals and carvings and hieroglyphics in walls, and the occasional like written records that we've been able to find.
Do you know what I think the interesting thing about specifically Egypt that kind of makes it difficult to find a lot of these stories and why the newer ones seem to help more is because like it was because of the Roman Empire, right? Like around the 3rd or 4th century AD, the Egyptian culture, they were just like, and the Christian mythology, the Christian religion just makes more sense. We should probably convert to that. Or at least that's how this book portrayed it.
Yeah.
You know, like, because primarily I think just because of how their religion is structured and how they live their day-to-day lives. Like, that is something that I want to get into after we're done talking about like the gods themselves. Like, they lived kind of insane lives.
It would seem that way today.
Yeah.
Although there are some staunch traditionalists in Egypt today that still live very similarly to how they did. I don't necessarily know if we're talking like they did in 1500 BC, but at least very similar to how they did in 1000 AD.
Yeah. A fascinating facet of ancient Egyptian culture is like their desire to be remembered.
Yes.
And I think that's why the more stories we find, the better image of their culture we get. Because I noticed that with a lot of cults in ancient Egypt, while the reason why there's so many different versions of every story is because each cult would tell it their own way. And so there would be inconsistencies throughout because every cult would relate it more to their...
It's like they're telling the same story with the same relative narrative structure, but they're switching out the main character.
Yeah.
And then they're like retconning details that sort of justify that. And that becomes especially prevalent when, for a very brief time, the pharaoh tried to make a monotheistic, and they all...
they fucking
what was
loved that.
Atum or...
I don't remember.
Atum?
And Atum...
Atum or something?
He was ruler for 300 years, supposedly. Right. So that... sorry. The most fascinating part of it to me was like just like the whole history of the gods and humanity and like who the rulers were, like how all that worked.
Yeah.
So I think actually that's kind of where we should start. Like, you wanted to talk about Osiris, right?
Yeah, in my mind, Osiris is the most significant member of the Egyptian pantheon. That's just a personal opinion.
Sure.
I'm sure the cult of anyone other than that would disagree. The cult of Thoth is turning in their stone graves.
I understand why you say that, though, because a very big part of their culture is literally the Book of the Dead.
Right, and he is the god of the dead.
Yeah.
Which I also found interesting just in reading this story because I'd known of Osiris, and as a child, I knew of Osiris as the murdered king. Like, that was him. He was a god because he was just this great man.
Really?
That got killed by his brother.
I didn't know any of that. I was reading about the story of Osiris and Seth for the first time when I was reading this. And I was like, wow.
I knew the first part of that story.
Okay.
I knew that Seth had killed him. And then his son avenged him. And so I was like, that's the story I was familiar with. And like, it was that story that when I watched Lion King, I was like, this is the story of Osiris. I was like, Osiris is Mufasa, Set is Scar. Scar kills Mufasa, Set killed Osiris. Simba is Horus, he comes back from exile, avenges his father, takes the rightful place as king. And so I was like, oh, that's it. I didn't know this, mummification, getting Isis pregnant. Then he goes to the underworld, he becomes the judge of the dead. And I'm sure I'd come across stuff that was like, yeah, Osiris is the judge of the dead. And I was just like, yep, checks out. And then I, ignored it.
Didn't really question it. You just accepted that information.
The contradiction between like Osiris and Anubis. Because Anubis is also a god of the dead. And technically he's
not a judge.
Correct. But he's like the god of the dead. And Osiris is, I guess, more technically characterized as god of resurrection.
Well,
which
Ra,
necessitates you to first be dead.
He resurrects Ra every night. So
right. And so it's more like Anubis is the god of you when you're actually dead.
Yeah.
And is like sort of guiding you through this. All right, you're going to get judged. We're going to weigh your soul over here against the feather of truth. You're going to see the 42 judges, make your proclamations, going to get on the boat. We're going to do the thing. Like, that's Anubis. And then Osiris is like, you're on the boat. Here we go, buddy. Rebirth. Like that's kind of where he takes over. But it says in the story that Anubis like steps down in his role to allow Osiris to have his domain.
There's a bit of that. Like even because in Egyptian mythology, gods do die eventually. Gods do age, and gods do eventually stop doing the thing that they were doing.
You actually see Ra become a bitter old man.
Yeah.
Which is hilarious. Because there's bitter old men all over mythology. Odin is a bitter old man, but he didn't start that way.
Right.
You know? Like he starts this young, naive, but powerful, yearning for wisdom, and then becomes a bitter old man because now he's wise. And he's like, I wish I didn't know as much now.
If only I'd kept my eye.
Right. And then Ra's just like, I'm getting tired. I don't want to keep doing this every day. And he's just handing out duties like, you do this now. You do this now. I don't want to do all that shit.
And then those people hand those tasks over eventually.
Right. And they also get to, there's a sort of deific retirement.
Yeah.
Built into the Egyptian mythology.
That I like.
Which is interesting.
Yeah. So since you're going to cover Osiris, I want to cover like everything before that briefly. Okay. And I say briefly, but you know.
As brief as is possible.
So, okay. So in the beginning, all there was none. That's N-U-N.
Yes.
Right? None is the limitless waters. Because as far as Egyptians are concerned, water is everything.
Yes.
Which makes sense from their perspective. I can see why they'd come to that conclusion.
And you'll find across many mythologies that the beginning is always water. That's like where things start for most. That's not inherently true for everything, but a lot of mythologies will begin with there was water. Yeah.
So the first 8 gods, they were primeval progenitors, kind of very similar, I think, in the way Egyptian mythology covers it, where it's like, so these gods, they have a human form, but Egyptians understood that like the human representations they were making of their gods was not at all representative of what entity they would actually see if they encountered these gods. It was just a way for them to understand them.
Yeah.
So the first 8 progenitor gods were they were in pairs, a male and female pairing. The males were, I believe, frogs, and the females were a type of snake. So you've got Nun and Nanet, the limitless waters, Ha and Hahet, which represent infinity, Kuk and Kaket, which represent darkness, and then Amun and Amunet, which represent hiddenness. So Amun is, in my opinion, the important one there, because Amun is what kicks off everything else.
Right.
So Amun was he was the god of that which is hidden. In Egyptian myth, in these stories, the sun comes, like the light, it comes from darkness.
Yes.
As far as Egyptians are concerned, darkness is everything, and light is just one of the things in darkness. So I find that really interesting because they don't view it as scary. And I can understand why they wouldn't view it as scary, because of the way they explain it all. Like, they make it seem, like, I don't know, it felt kind of comforting, the way they were describing it. Because something that I was forgetting about that was very important is stars.
Well, and that's an interesting thing to take into account when you're looking at mythologies across different cultures, is the environment and their experience of the environment is going to shape how they see things. Most places, mythology typically represents darkness as at least more overtly a negative thing. It's scary. It's something to be afraid of. There are good things that can be associated with darkness, like sleep, like sex. Like, there's things that they're like, yeah, that happens at night, and that's good. But there's also like inherent danger. There's wolves. There's monsters in the dark you can't see, which is dangerous. But if you live in the desert, and the daytime temperatures are going to get up to 125 degrees Fahrenheit.
A little humidity, though.
You're looking forward to nighttime.
Yeah.
Because nighttime is more comfortable. It's a little colder, yes, but I've always been of the opinion I'd rather be cold than hot. because I can always put more layers on. I can only get so naked. I can only sweat so much before I'm just like, that's it. I'm done. I mean, can't anymore.
There were farming tribes that would reap their what they sowed during the full moon.
Yeah. Because it's easier to do. And so in an environment like that, it's not difficult to see why they would have seen darkness and nighttime as a comforting thing.
Well, anyways, so you've got a Mun, who not much is known about a Mun, and that's kind of a good thing.
Well, I think it'd be ironic if you did know a lot about him, seeing he's the god of hidden things.
Well, they say that a lot of the things that he hides, I liken it akin to a Greek god showing their true deific form, right? Like a lot of what he's hiding from you is stuff that would kill you.
Right. It's very, very H.P. Lovecraft in that way. It's like, no. If you looked at my real face,
right,
you'd go fucking insane. You can't handle it.
Right. So Amun begat a Tum. A Tum, I'll need you to fill in the blanks for me a little bit here. A Tum is what, as I understand it, he is simultaneously the culmination of and the creation of perfect evolution. Is the way the Egyptians looked at it. Is that?
Yeah, I would say, to put it more succinctly, he is the ideal being.
Yeah.
But not like, don't think of it as like he's the ideal human. He's the ideal of existence.
Yeah.
Of all things.
Yeah.
Like, he is the perfect human plus the perfect river plus the perfect crocodile plus the perfect mountain, all wrapped into one deity. He is perfection itself.
Yes, so, anyways, so then Atum, he jerked off and begat Shu and Tefnut.
That's right. That's right.
In one version he jerked off. In another version he sneezed.
Yes.
And in another version it was his spit.
The important thing is that there is some sort of bodily essence that is being ejected of his that gives rise to living things.
I just, side note, I find it hilarious how phallically obsessed the Egyptians were. That was noted a lot in my book.
It's only going to get worse. So I will say a lot of the stuff that we have read so far, there is much phallic innuendo.
I know. And
I
love it.
There is so much.
I love it.
There are some cultures that have bypassed the what we would consider the modern prudeness of innuendo.
Oh yeah.
There is, when we get to Polynesian stuff, I wanted to talk about one of the adventures of Maui, who has now become more popularized thanks to the movie Moana.
Okay.
Maui actually steals the wife of an eel, an ocean monster.
Okay.
Named Tetuna, which means penis.
Okay.
He is an eel whose name is penis.
Fantastic.
And like, that's a crux of the story. Like, that's a big element of the fact that it's like, hey, penis is gonna come get you. And Maui is like, bring it, dog. So there's that. When reading certain things, just remember, we're seeing it through a lens of today's culture where we're like, it's not polite to write like that. And some of those cultures felt the same way. And so some of the more overtly sexual aspects have been removed. And then some cultures are like, no, man, that's how it was.
And so that's what I find so hilarious about, as an adult, learning about Egyptian mythology. So this is another funny
And that's why
part.
I said, like, there are some things I would not have told a grade school child, because
that was a funny
that's not
part.
appropriate.
Because when I went to the public library, there were 2 books about mythology that fit my purposes.
Right.
The 2 that I described to you. Because I went to someone to help me, and he was like, it's funny, most of the Egyptian books are in the juvenile section. And I was like, no, that makes sense. That makes perfect sense. you're a kid, you learn about Egyptian mythology. You don't
Right.
touch that again when you're
Every
an adult.
kid that I've ever met that grew up in America had an Egyptology phase.
Yes.
We all got one book about it. It was cheap, hardbound plastic book. Probably had a scarab on the front. Like everyone did it.
And hey, fun fact, it's a very whitewashed lens of that of that culture.
It's the Western child version of it. They really just talk about mummies. That's the big thing.
Yeah, like
mummies.
that's pretty much all I knew about. I was less interested in like Osiris and the mummification process. Like they get into that. There's a whole chapter dedicated to it. That was the one chapter I didn't feel I needed to read.
He was the first mummy. Yep.
Yeah. Atum, he gives birth to Shu and Tefnut. Shu is the atmosphere.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Right.
What is Tefnut? I don't remember.
Oh, he put me on the spot. Tefnut, I don't recall exactly. Tefnut. Come back to me.
I will. Well, so those two, even though they're siblings, are also husband and wife. There's a lot of that.
Yes. That's every.
It is. But this one, I don't know. I've noticed that it's much more insular. Right?
Yes.
With this one. Well, anyway, so Shu and Tefnut, they give birth to Geb and Nut. So Geb is the earth, Nut is the sky. So hold on, I wrote down some stuff about them. Well, I'll come back to it. So then Geb and Nut, they had 4 or 5 children, right? So they had Osiris, Seth, Isis, and Nephthys.
Mm-hmm.
In some versions, Osiris and Isis had Horus.
Right.
In other versions, Geb and Nut had Horus. There's a discrepancy there depending on what cult you look at.
So what I had read was that there's actually 2 Horuses.
I read there was 3.
There is, well,
there's probably
seems
more
like
than
there's
that.
at least 2.
Right.
The ones that I had read about were described as Horus the Elder and Horus the Younger.
You keep talking. I need to text my wife real quick.
Okay. However, I did find Tefnut, which is Shu's female principle, and is the goddess of mist and the source of moisture in the early universe.
Oh.
So sort of the feminine water.
The feminine water.
Mhm.
Nice. I think I wrote down in here somewhere that she also represents the upper Dwight, which is like, it's like a river that flows through the land of the dead.
Mm-hmm.
Kara's bringing McDonald's.
Nice.
That's what she was texting me about.
Exciting.
I would love 20-piece McNuggets.
Ooh.
So I can share with you.
Aw,
Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah. I would like 20-piece McNuggets and large fries and
a sponsorship.
And a sponsorship. You know what? Hang on, you're right. It's time.
Functionally
It's
Literate,
time for.
sponsored by.
It's time for an ad moment. Hi, this is Functionally Literate. Hope you've been enjoying listening. This episode is brought to you by me. I made this show. I'm Ryan. I'm broke. If you could donate a little money my way with a sponsorship or a product, like, I'll be a shill for money. And I'm going to use that money with which to buy books. Because let me tell you, right now I'm checking stuff out of the library, and it's rough. That's it. That was the ad.
Good ad read. That's a good ad read. For those of you that think that was improv, you are incorrect. I saw him reading off a script. That was all planned. This is all a character. It's a persona. This isn't real. He's not lying, though. He will be a shill.
Yes, I will. Yes, I will.
For money, not for free.
For money.
Not an ideological shill, just a capitalist.
And I won't be a shill for everyone. I have morals. There are some things more important than money. Tread lightly. Or don't. The worst that I'll do is say no.
True.
There's part of the probably Osiris, you're right, is going to be the most interesting story because a lot of what I have to say, it's like little factoids about like just the whole thing, right? So you've got, Atum, I guess the one story I have is the mankind myth, right? So Atum gave birth to Shu and Tefnet, and those two were like, wow, we just were born. We want to explore the world. And Atum was like, sure, I want you to be safe though, so I'm going to send my eye with you. And then he separated from himself a part of his ka, or his bow, I guess. I'm a little unclear on some of the terminology. Basically, there's this thing where any god can separate a part of themselves to make a new being in Egyptian mythology, which is part of why I feel like the Egyptian pantheon is so confusing. I texted you that yesterday, and you were like, not yesterday, but I was like, this pantheon is confusing, and you were like, yes, indeed.
Correct.
Correct.
It is confusing. Yes.
He then made, he didn't birth, he made the Eye of Atum, also known as the Eye of Ra. It's a little confusing. So that eye went with them. And then while the three of them were gone, he made a new eye. The glorious one. Does the same shit, but it's a different one.
That's right.
Eventually, Shu and Tefnet, they come back, to their dad, and the Eye of Atum is pissed. Not just pissed. Deeply saddened, right? Goes on a bit of a rampage, but also cries a lot. And all of those tears spawned humanity.
There you go.
That's one version. There's another version. The other version is that Atum was alone and without anyone, not even his mother. And so he just cried so he wouldn't be alone anymore. Because his cries, his tears, spawned humanity. Either way, humanity came from Atum.
Right.
And then I find the first version more interesting because in that version, he didn't create humanity on purpose. It was an accident, and then he felt responsible for humanity, and so became the first king of Egypt.
What do you think it means that in either story, humans are the result of tears?
Well, it comes back to water, I think.
That's part of it, but what I'm getting at is that there's an association with human creation and sadness.
I think it's from like a desire to not be alone. And people often cry when they feel most alone, right? Like something deeply saddening happens and then they feel separated. But crying, it's cathartic, and people respond to crying. I think it's interesting that a god cried and then a bunch of tangentially,
not just a god, the perfect being.
The perfect being was alone, and that made him sad. And so he decided to not be alone anymore in this great moment of sadness. In that version.
The Eye of Ra.
Or the Eye of Ra
was sad at being replaced.
Yeah. Which, funny thing, moved by the Eye of Ra's great sadness, which is now a separate being. Even though it came from Atum/Ra, no longer part of him. So what he does to alleviate the eye's sadness is he takes it and he puts it on his forehead, and it turns into a cobra that is just wrapped around his forehead. It's a very iconic look among pharaohs. I'm sure you've seen something along those lines.
Yeah. The cobra that's standing up. You've got the solar disc. Sometimes you've got feathers or horns on either side.
The Eye of Ra is often symbolized by the solar disc.
Right.
Yeah.
Lots of symbols of authority kind of worked into there.
Yeah, so now I want to draw the distinction between Atum and Ra. So Atum was his first form. Ra is his most popular form.
Right.
Ra is the god of the sun. Atum is also the god of the sun. They're the same person, but they have different names depending on the time of day. Ra is at his most powerful,
Right.
at
The
noon.
noon sun.
Right. And then Atum is the evening sun, the old god.
Yes.
So this is the thing that I find is interesting, and of course is going to get into Osiris, is his age is tied to the sun cycle. At the beginning of the day, he's young.
Yes.
At noon, he's at his zenith. And then from there, he plateaus and just ages until he dies. And through death, travels down to Osiris, like you said. And then, and this is where we get into the other interesting thing about gods, the Egyptian gods, is this thing called syncretization. Not synchronization, syncretization. Where gods will take on or merge with the aspects of other gods in order to accomplish things. And this was also something very important that comes into magic and being a magician, because anybody can do this. Anybody can take on the form of a god through magic to accomplish something, right? Something within their domain, which is really important when you have gods that do this, because you'll have one god that wants to accomplish something, but it's just out of their domain. Right. So like a really popular example that this book gave was Ra combining with, let's say, Khonshu, right? The god of the sun combining with a god of the moon to then be able to observe all that there is to observe, day or night.
Right.
So another name for him is Ra Atum, or Re Atum. That was confusing, like R-E or R-A. Because I always knew him as Ra, but this book throughout referred to him as Re.
Right.
So yeah, and so then you've got Osiris, who was married to Nephthys, and then Seth, who was married to Isis. Is that right? Or do I have that backwards?
It's Set, Nephthys, Osiris, and Isis. I don't know if that's what you just said, but that is the correct one.
Osiris and Isis they were married.
Yes.
And Seth and Nephthys were married.
Yes.
Fun fact.
They were all brothers and sisters.
They were all brothers and sisters, but they were married. They were from the womb, each coupled.
Yes.
All four of them were coupled. Fun fact, Osiris still fucked Nephthys, though.
Yeah, so one of the purported reasons to sort of humanize Set and make him, I guess, slightly more justified for some reason.
Slightly.
Nephthys was very jealous of Isis.
Yeah.
And very much desired Osiris as the better of the two brothers. And so whether she seduced him or simply made an offer and he was like, yeah. Osiris did sleep with her. And left something behind. I can't remember exactly what it was. It was like a garland or a sash or something, some article of clothing that Set found and was like, obviously you slept with my brother. This is pretty messed up.
So in what I was reading, Osiris got them confused because they look the same.
That could be easy to do.
Right.
If they do look the same. I don't know.
And there was a secret child born because of that, whose name I did not write down.
In some versions, that child is Anubis.
In some versions.
In some versions.
That's
because
the
Anubis
child that...
is the son of Set and Nephthys.
Yeah.
But there are some tellings of the story say that he is technically the bastard son of Osiris.
Yeah.
But to protect him from Set, Nephthys never said anything about it.
Yeah.
And since Set is a roughly canine looking, there's actually no animal that Set is associated with that we know of. It's just called the Set beast. Whereas like all the other Egyptian gods, you know, they're anthropomorphized with the head of an animal, or they're just shown as an animal. Like Anubis is a jackal.
Yeah. Or jackal-headed.
Or a man with a jackal head.
Yeah.
Set, we don't know what that animal is.
Yeah.
It's not a jackal.
Yeah.
It's similar. It's canine-ish, but anytime you see the full animal form, it looks like some sort of small dog with 2 tails.
I don't want that.
And what I find interesting about this is that, at least in all the other Egyptian gods, none of them are made-up animals.
Yeah, they're all actual creatures that they
So
would encounter
either
in Egypt.
Set is the only made-up animal, which he is sort of the villain of the pantheon. So if there's going to be one thing that's
easily
like a fantastical creature, that's one to pick.
Like, everything was hunky-dory until Seth came along. Then it got dark.
Or there's some extinct animal of ancient Egypt that they associated with that must have been pretty bad for them to associate it with Set that we don't know about.
For what it's worth, so tying this a little bit into how ancient Egyptians lived their lives, they had something that I find akin to horoscopes.
Mm-hmm.
So because of certain stories, there would, like, that happened on certain days of the year.
Yep.
On those days, it's like, okay, hey, today was the day that Horus and Seth had a sleepover, and then Seth got a little bit horny in the middle of the night and put his penis between Horus's thighs and splooged a little bit. So we're not going to talk about Seth today. On this day specifically, we're not talking about Seth. Don't say his name. As an example.
Right.
There were other times where it's like, hey, don't go out on the full moon this night.
Yeah.
You know, or
this sort of astronomical fortune telling,
or cast this spell before you leave work today.
Yeah,
you know, something like that.
Yeah. There's a lot of the day-to-day sort of small rituals. I always thought were really interesting, just based off the belief. But why I started liking mythology to begin with is because I wanted to know where that came from.
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, why are you doing that?
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't make sense. And then you hear the stories and you're like, I still don't think it makes sense. And then it takes someone to be like, okay, well, so in the story, this happens. You go, I read the story. I know it's that. And,
yeah.
Well, so now this part symbolizes that. And that's why and someone who knows why will explain it to you and you go, oh, fuck. That all makes so much more sense now.
Mm-hmm.
Now I see why you look like you're absolutely insane.
Yeah. But
It's
you have to look at the whole.
it.
You've got to look at the whole thing because it's about the stories. Like the magic is the stories.
Yeah.
All of their magic is associated with this story. Like this happened in this story. So if you tell this story in this way, you will then embody like some character in that story and be able to use that power. Mm-hmm. Like this is how you merge.
And something in Egyptian mythology that a lot of fantasy readers would probably be familiar with is the concept of true names.
Yes, that was something that came up a lot.
And so
it came up at least twice.
There's a lot of like fantasy stories that'll revolve around a magic system, or some facet of the magic system revolves around true names. If you know the true name of a thing, then you have power over it, or something like that.
Yeah,
it was big in Aragon. I think the Patrick Rothfuss series. Name of the Wind. That's
Name
the one.
of the Wind.
It's about like learning the true names of the elements. And so that's still a common theme now. And like Isis is associated with magic. She's like the magician. She's very powerful magically. And part of that is because she basically conned Ra's true name out of him.
Straight up.
Because he's like, it's way too powerful. I can't tell anybody that. And she just poisoned him. And I was like, I'll fix you if you tell me your name.
And he eventually does.
And he's like, nah, I'm going to tell you a fake name. She's like, I mean, I know that's a fake name. And you're just going to die if you don't tell me. And he's like, all right. I'll tell you part of my true name. And she's like, that's not going to work. I need your whole name. Or you're going to die. And so he did. And then she healed him.
And it was bullshit, too, because like she was acting like she didn't poison him.
No. She was like, I don't know who poisoned you. If you want me to find out, you got to tell me your true name.
Yeah.
She was pretty shady about it, but that's why she's associated with magic and with healing.
Okay,
she was able to heal Ra.
We got 20 minutes. My bit was not brief at all.
All right, I'm going to power through
Osiris.
real quick. Bullet points.
Osiris.
Story of Osiris. He was the first pharaoh of Egypt.
Yes,
purportedly.
His
brother Set, or Seth, depending on the spelling, was very jealous of him.
Probably for sleeping
Osiris, presumably for sleeping with his wife and fathering a bastard child.
Yeah.
Anubis, the god of the dead. Osiris throws a big party. Everybody's invited. It's great. Set goes, I have a sick idea for this. Builds a coffin. He had secretly gotten Osiris's measurements. I don't know how. Doesn't matter. He got them. Builds a coffin exactly to his size, but it's beautiful. It's made out of gold. It's intricately carved, well painted. Magnificent chest. And he says, hey, just as a little party trick, anybody who gets in this and fits perfectly, they can have it. And so everybody gets in, doesn't fit anybody. And then jokingly Set's like, hey, how about you, bro? And he goes, nah, okay, I'll try it. Gets in, fits perfect. And then 72 of Set's accomplices slam the lid down, nail it shut, and throw it in the Nile.
One moment. My wife is here with food.
Micadandos.
Hello. Thank you, my dear.
Thank you, Cara.
We appreciate you. Okay. She just dabbed and dipped out.
So they just yeet him into the Nile. Just straight up fuck that guy.
Mhm.
So the chest floats down river. It gets stuck in a tree. The tree grows up around it. It gets absorbed inside this tree. So now the core of this tree is the coffin that is holding Osiris. So this tree gets super big. It becomes very famous. Some maids from a nearby king would go down by this river and they'd wash their clothes. They see the huge tree. They go back to like, whoa, there's a big tree down there. The king's like, sick, chop it down. I want it for a pillar in my palace. And they're like, yeah, of course. So they go and they chop it down. They build this really cool pillar with Osiris still inside. Isis comes looking for the chest because she's like, I want my husband back. This is bullshit. Comes to the area. These women are washing their stuff. And she's like, wow, there's this really big tree here. And I feel like that's probably where my husband was. Sees these women washing clothes. And they're blown away by, they're seeing Isis. And they're like, oh my God, we got to go tell the queen about this. They run back, they tell the queen. Come back, they're like, hey, the queen wants to meet you. So Isis disguises herself as a maid, comes to the queen. And the queen's just like, yeah, no, you can come work for me. That'd be great. You seem like a stand-up character. And so she's like, yeah. And the queen hires her not just as a maid, but also the king and queen's son is sick. And they need help. And they're like, are you like a kind of healer? And it's Isis. So she's like, yeah, I can heal. So she agrees, I'll heal your son. However, you can't watch me do the treatment. And then I'll ask for my payment afterward. And the queen's like, sure, no problem. And then, as one does, she sneaks in to see what the treatment is because she wants to know. And she sees this woman that she doesn't know as Isis holding her son in a fire.
Yeah.
And so she comes in and is like, whoa, stop burning my child, please.
Don't burn my child.
And so then she reveals herself as Isis and is like, you foolish woman.
Dumb bitch.
I was burning away the mortality out of him. You have stopped him from being an immortal god.
And I knew you were going to freak out when you saw this, which is why I didn't want you in here.
And also, it's like, I mean, I told you not to do that. But the son is better. He's not immortal, but he's at least not sick now. And so Isis requests the chest out of the center of the pillar. She's like, you keep the pillar. I just want the box that's in it. And the king's like, absolutely. You can have whatever you want. So it takes it. She travels back to Egypt to try to revive him. Set discovers this, finds it, cuts his body up into a bunch of pieces and scatters them throughout Egypt.
There's a few different versions of this. He was cut up into 7 pieces, 16 pieces, 21 pieces.
Yeah, 14 pieces.
14 pieces.
There's a lot of different ones.
In all versions, though, penis was never found.
That's right. The penis could not be recovered. That darn phallus. That immortal symbol of male potency could not be found.
Nope. Sorry about ya.
So then Isis, now with sympathy from her sister Nephthys, searches for all of the pieces, manages to find them all, and bind him together in linens. This is the first mummification. Mm-hmm. He had to be mummified because he was in pieces. Mm-hmm. Now, they never found the penis.
Nope.
But they were able to use magic in some versions with the help of Thoth to revive him just enough that somehow, also in some versions, his phallus was restored through this magic to impregnate Isis with Horus.
Temporarily revived Osiris
With his
to
penis.
have one final child, Horus.
Some nice
It was,
goodbye mourning sex.
Yes.
Some grief sex.
Mourning, as in with the
With
U.
the
Not
U,
not
yes.
morning sex, which is pleasant. Morning sex, like I'm very sad.
Well, we don't know what time of day it was. But anyway, she's able to get pregnant, is pregnant with Horus. She hides like in a swampy areas, presumably of the Nile Delta, away from Set, so Set doesn't come and kill her. Horus is raised. He becomes a man and he goes, I'm going to go get revenge for my father. And eventually does. It's sort of a long, complicated process. There's court trials involved. There's combat. There's other things. Horus does kill Isis at least twice, beheads her, and then she just kind of puts her head back on and is like, well, I'm healing in magic, so that's not going to be enough. And he's like, no, you're fine. I took out my anger. I'm good now.
I missed that one.
Well, there's a point where there's some contest. There's like a swimming contest between Horus and Set, and Isis tries to shoot an arrow at Set but misses and hits Horus.
Damn.
And so he just cuts her head off because he's like, stop interfering.
No, wait, no, I do remember
And
that
then-
one.
then there's-
they were in a challenge.
Yeah.
They had to like be underwater for 3 months or
Yeah,
something.
it was something
and
insane
then
like
and
that.
then Isis hit him with a harpoon,
To try to get him to come up and breathe.
and then she tried to hit Seth, and Seth was like, "No, don't hit me. I'm your brother." And she was like, "Yeah,
"Good
oh,
point."
good point." And then fucking Horus is pissed.
Yeah, rightfully so. And then there's another time Horus, this time a military conflict. Horus has an army. He's chasing Set's army. Finally is about to corner and kill him, and Isis lets him go because she feels just a brief moment of sympathy for her brother. Lets him go, and Horus is like, "Why the fuck would you do that?"
Yeah.
Cuts her head off again. Main point here is for Osiris is he then takes charge of the underworld with the assistance of Anubis, becomes the judge of the dead. So he's helped by his possibly bastard son, who obviously shows no loyalty to Set.
Yeah, which kicked off an 80-year political campaign where Horus and Seth were arguing who should be the rightful king.
Yes.
I'm pretty sure Set's logic was he was dead and Isis brought him back to have Horus. Horus has no legitimacy to the throne because I had the throne before he was born.
Right. So you can't be the heir because he was already dead.
Mm-hmm.
I was the rightful king because I would have been the next in line.
Mm-hmm.
So you have no claim. There's some trickery about how they get around it. Basically, Isis transforms into something to seduce Set and is like crying, she's supposed to be this helpless pretty woman and is crying, and Set's like, this is an easy target.
I'm gonna fuck you.
Like a predator.
Yeah.
And is like, oh my God, sweetheart, what's wrong? You should smile more. I'm assuming he said these things. He didn't actually say these things.
The way it's described, it was pretty spot on, though.
And she's like, well, my husband is dead, and his brother is trying to steal all our property from my son, and I don't know what to do about it. And Set's like, well, he has no claim to that. It obviously belongs to your son, thinking the sympathy would get him laid. And then she just transforms into Isis and goes, gotcha, bitch, and then runs away to the judges and is like, guess what this motherfucker just said? And they all were kind of like, hey, you really put your foot in your mouth there, Set.
One moment for rapper. Continue.
This is where we would have otherwise done a product review for our sponsors. So basically it's a story more or less of sort of the constant struggle between order and chaos. Set is chaos, Osiris and Horus are order, or like the cycle of life, the sort of the father coming up, dying, the son taking the place, and the problems that intervene in that sort of thing. But the common archetypes are there. You have Osiris, who is the king. He's the ideal man. He's murdered by those that are jealous of him, so there's always some flaw in the ideal, usually naivety, because he got in the box like an idiot, and usually overthrown by the greed of somebody else. And then there's the conflict between the rightful owner of a thing or the rightful heir with the usurper. A lot of very archetypal themes that you see repeated across. I mean, I see them in Christianity all the time. It's very influenced by Egyptian mythology, to the point that even, I mean, people have often said, like, well, Jesus basically is
I mean,
Osiris.
Egypt is an integral part to Abrahamic myths.
Right.
Abrahamic, or legend, if you prefer.
The Hebrews were slaves there for a very long time. So to think that from that point there wasn't some sort of influence would just be silly. But yeah, so you have your archetypal father. He's just, he's righteous, he's your ideal. He's the king of his domain. It specifies he's king of the earth and the sky, so he's even king of the places no other king can touch. But Set, which is the chaos, is always going to try to disrupt the established order. That's the function of his existence is, oh, all of this is put how it should be? No, we're not going to do that. And he's tearing it apart. Usually that, at least narratively, kind of fleshes itself out as in someone that thinks they can do it better, but doesn't actually know how to do it. You know? And that's why I still liken it to Lion King, and that it's like Scar thinks he can be the better king, but he has no idea how to be a king. He just wants to do it because he thinks he's better.
It's true.
And what happens to the entire
It's all
area? It all goes to shit. It goes into chaos.
lightning round.
Right.
I have something I would like to contribute to the whole the other part of that, like what Anubis is judging, right? So he doesn't do the judging by himself. There's actually 42 gods that each represent a sin that you have to, as part of your judgment, you know, when your heart is being weighed, have to swear to that you didn't commit the sin that is related to them. And I have a list of some but not all of the 42 transgressions, if you'd like to hear them.
Yeah, let's hear them.
Babbling, being sullen, stealing bread, misbehaving, eavesdropping, being impatient, being loud-voiced, killing a sacred bull, blaspheming in your city, conjuring magic against the king.
I can truthfully say I have never conjured magic against the king. Never done that. Babbling? All right, you got me on that one. I do that. You get me on a roll with something I'm interested in and I know a lot about, you're about to know everything I know about it.
And I think this list of 42 things is the crux of why the Egyptians behaved the way that the ancient Egyptians behaved the way that they did. Because they were basically given a list of 42 things that pharaohs didn't want the public to do.
Don't babble. Keep that shit to yourself.
Don't fucking eavesdrop.
That's right. Don't be listening to other people's conversations.
Don't fuck my wife. That's one of them.
I think in the context of this is a pharaoh going, you know what? We're going to make up some rules because I don't want these people doing it. They were at least egalitarian enough to say, don't fuck anybody's wife. I mean, especially not mine, but really nobody's. Don't touch anybody's wife.
Yeah. Yeah, and there were a few variations of that. Because it wasn't don't have sex out of wedlock. It was don't have sex with someone else's wife, especially if you're out of wedlock.
Right.
I don't know why especially, but
I don't know. It seems to me that it'd be worse if you were married and then had an affair with another married person than if you were single. I mean, they're awful either way. But it's like, well, one's ruining one marriage and the other's ruining two marriages, one of which is your own. That seems worse to me.
But they're different, right? Like, it's not exactly the same. There's a little bit of overlap there, right? Because the Book of the Dead is all like that, right? The Book of the Dead is literally just like, oh, okay, the Book of the Dead, an adventure guide. Here's what you need to do. We got to wrap up.
Yep.
But the Book of the Dead was just this giant tome of things that could work. There was no map. It was like, okay, you're here. Here's what you need. Here's the guideposts that you need to follow to go here or here or here.
Right.
If you encounter this thing, say this. If that doesn't work, say this. If that doesn't work, say this. And the whole thing is full of spells specifically for when you're in the land of the dead. Spells that don't work if you're in the land of the living.
Right. They're just to help you there.
And one of the things that was very important was if someone died, you ensured that they had a copy of the Book of the Dead on their body.
Yeah, that's why most of what we knew for a very long time about Egyptian mythology came exclusively from the Book of the Dead.
For good reason.
And as we get, we find more archaeological sites, we find more written evidence that the more modern tellings of the stories are probably more correct because we filled in some of these holes that the Book of the Dead didn't cover because it really was just an instruction manual. It wasn't meant as the religious text of the Egyptians.
No.
It was the how-to of dead people. So we only have parts. So as we uncover more things, we get a little bit more. Final thoughts.
Not my favorite. I liked the Norse ones more.
Too phallic.
Too phallic.
Too phallic.
I mean, like, don't get me wrong, I
Oh,
love
man.
making fun of it, but like,
gonna
it's
get-
not my favorite.
You're gonna get less in favor of these as
Oh,
we go.
no! What are we doing next?
So let me hit my final thoughts.
Sure, go
Final
ahead.
thoughts. I think the Osiris myth is center, at least to the day-to-day lives of most Egyptians, because it is sort of the origination of mummification, which was a big part of everybody's life. That's how everybody got buried,
Mm-hmm.
at least if you could afford it. It really established a lot of like authoritative norms for pharaohs. And I think knowing that you're going to be resurrected in some form or another would have been very calming
Mm-hmm.
to a lot of people that lived a very harsh life in a very harsh environment. Narratively, I think it really just goes to show the established order will always at some point feel out of date and will eventually descend into chaos. But if enough people act, then it will be superseded by a greater, more encompassing order.
Well
So,
said.
That's what I think. Next, we will be starting our foray into Eastern mythology.
Like Asia?
That's right. The Orient, if you will.
Okay.
Um,
Specifically.
so, as of right now, the plan is Hindu, Buddhist, Chinese, and Japanese mythologies.
Okay.
If in the course of covering those we find some more we want to incorporate, I didn't think Taoist needed to be its own because that's going to really be that's most of the Chinese.
Tao is more of
gonna
a
be-
guidebook. I don't think there's
Right,
really any.
it's just kind of the way to live
I
more
don't
than
think
it
there's
is.
any theology
mythology.
or mythology related to it.
Well, there's myths of how do you say?
Well, I mean,
Lao
it's
Tse.
incorporated into other things.
Well,
it's not its own.
and that's why I was like, we don't need to do Taoist as its own thing because that's really just the myth of Lao Tse.
Mm.
If I'm saying his name right. Be prepared. If you thought we butchered these names,
Mm.
if you thought our pronunciation of Tefnut and Amun-Ra was bad,
Oh, did I say it's
I don't
not
know.
Tefnet?
I have no idea.
Oh.
I don't know. You could have been right, and I'm fucking it up. Maybe you fucked it up, and I'm right. I don't know.
Oh,
But if
fair
you
enough.
thought our pronunciation of Icelandic and Greek and Egyptian names was bad,
Well, we're white guys.
it's not getting easier, folks.
No.
Because now we're going into Asia.
All right. Well, that's all we've got for you today. I hope you enjoyed listening to us just talk about Egyptian mythology.
Y'all, we need to do another Egyptian mythology. Forgot the most important part of Egyptian mythology. We all know that Egyptian gods are aliens that host humans.
Oh God.
And that they came and supplanted us and buried a Stargate. Okay, we never talked about that's like the basic of Egypt.
So
Is this a Stargate nerd thing? I don't watch. I
no,
don't watch
no.
Stargate.
So this book actually talks about this. Hang on.
It should. Because
There's a
it's
section in here. So there's this comet or meteor or something called Apophis, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. That's a character in Stargate. The character in Stargate was named after the Egyptian creature.
Mhm.
But the comet was named after the Stargate character.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yes.
Isn't that the
Beautiful.
darkness that chases the solar boat and tries to devour Ra?
Sure is. And that's a comet that people were genuinely worried was going to hit the planet, and they have confirmed won't.
Nice. That's good.
Beautiful.
If you want to hear some nonsense about all kinds of mythology, because I'm a big fan of conspiracy theories,
Nice.
Fingerprint of the Gods.
You've mentioned this one.
It is written by Graham Hancock,
I'm gonna put it in my
who
phone.
is an absolute lunatic. However, the jumps in logic that he makes are so fantastic.
Yeah.
Love it.
His general thesis is that there was a superior progenitor race.
Uh-huh.
I will commend him for not claiming they were white. But
Now to be clear, this is what kind of recommendation is this?
this is if you want to be entertained by conspiracy theory. Read this.
This is Zach's conspiracy theory book recommendation.
Yeah. No. Don't take any of this seriously.
Because I don't.
It'll be very damaging to your worldview and relationships.
I don't want to look at this later and be like, Zach recommends Fingerprint of the Gods, and like not have any more context than that.
Yeah. Because then you're gonna read and go, "Oh, Zach's a
cut.
nut job." dude."
You can also cut after the outro. That's why I didn't interrupt the show to tell you about Stargate.
Appreciate it. I appreciate it.
I was waiting though. I'm like, come on, bring up Stargate. That's the truth. That's the most accurate.
So
That's the
in,
truth.
So
he said.
in the
He's a universal Calvinist, but Stargate's real,
so
bro.
in the epilogue, it talks about this a little bit. It talks about it speculates about how ancient Egyptians would have felt about their legacy. And it concludes that probably the majority of ancient Egyptians are just happy that they're remembered. Because that is the thing that they were scared of most, was the true death when no one remembers you. Right? Like if you became an Ak, that would be very like that was the ideal, right? Like, to pass your judgment and become an Ak and be able to do as you please and explore the entire world, including that which is outside of Set.
In all fairness,
Or
their culture
rather.
was meant they wanted to be remembered in the culture at the time.
Yeah.
So they deliberately did things that hopefully would allow them to be remembered.
Yeah.
Whereas there's probably a lot of cultures as old as Egypt, but they weren't conscious about so they're just gone.
Yeah,
They'll never be able to know
they
what they are.
vanished.
Yeah. And I think that's probably why Egypt is one of the most popular, is because of their just enduring desire to be remembered.
Well, and think about how little we know about them, given the immense amount of effort they put into being remembered. I mean, just... You got 20 nuts.